Hello, and welcome to Build a Trusted Data Sharing Capability with Data Republic. When you join today's webinar, you selected Join, either by phone call or your computer audio. If for any reason you'd like to change that selection, you can do so by accessing the audio pane in your control panel. From the same control panel, you have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing those questions into the questions pane. We'll collect those questions and address them during the Q&A session towards the end of today's presentation. If for some reason we're not able to get to your question, we plan on responding to each one of them personally through email. This deck will be available through SlideShare along with a recording of the webinar 2 to 3 days after the conclusion of the presentation, so please keep an eye out for that. My name is Ryan Peterson. I'm the Global Technology Segment Lead for Data at Amazon Web Services. I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar. Included with me today, you'll hear from Frank McKenna, the Chief Product Officer for Data Republic, as well as Jeff Bentaplay, the Head of Data Innovation and Partnerships for ANZ Bank. We're going to talk a little bit about overviewing data governance inside of AWS. Data Republic will talk about the trusted data sharing platform that they've created, and ANZ will talk about unlocking analytic insights with the data sharing technology that they're using. And like we said, we'll go into Q&A. The goal today is to learn a little about how to establish a data sharing control center where transactions can be governed and managed, really in response to things that are happening within GDPR. We're going to learn how to build a value and long-term collaboration system with a scale and repeatable data sharing system, and learn how to rapidly establish trust and secured spaces for collaborative analytics. A little bit about AWS. Our customers tell us that there's 5 major reasons they choose us. First one is agility, the ability to quickly spin up a service, a piece of software, and get moving on it quickly. The second one around elasticity is giving the ability to scale an application rapidly and in an automated fashion. The third one is around globalization. So whatever you get going right in one country, you can get going right in the second country by easily replicating that process. Cost, of course, because you don't have to build data centers, you don't have to go buy too much computers and end up having too much or have too little to take care of the business. And finally, the myriad of functions that we continue to add to the environment in the 1,000+ per year give us a lot of breadth to the product lines. But we're here to talk about a big issue that's been on the front page of the news way too often. Just in the last couple of minutes of my talking, over 10,000 records have been breached from various organizations across the globe. With 1,700+ incidents just in 2017, we can see that in one given year, nearly half the world's population was breached in some way. Now, malicious outsiders are kind of the common thought of when the CISOs think about how do we protect data against. It's those malicious outsiders, but I would venture to say that the malicious insiders are the bigger issue. People that you expect to trust within your organization, if given the right access and given the wrong day for them, they may end up becoming a malicious insider and use the data inappropriately. In some cases, too, just by accident, they can walk out. 18% of the cases is an accidental loss of data by somebody just treating data incorrectly. So we started asking C-level executives across the globe, how do you answer these questions? And these are the questions they started asking us. I don't know what data I collect. I don't know where I store it. I don't know if I have the correct legal statements. I don't know when I delete it or why I should delete it. And in this particular case, as we're talking Data Republic, I don't know who I share it with. Obviously, very big newsworthy incidents over the last year around sharing data inappropriately. So how do I ensure that the data I'm sharing is done appropriately? Now, customers weren't the only ones that were creating concerns, and regulators across the globe have been dealing with privacy-related questions for years. PCI DSS, for example, in the payment systems, has been one that's been an early adopter of making sure privacy is integrated into customer processes. But the big one that just came out in May is GDPR. GDPR is really 100% focused on consumer privacy. With the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, taking on many of the same articles that GDPR has written, and then we're seeing a proliferation of that to various countries, Brazil, Canada, Australia, Thailand, Singapore, and more. We realized this is a growing problem that our customers needed to have answers for. So we got into thinking about what the core issue is. And if you think about the core issue is of privacy, it's the consumer identities, the PII, as we call it. And so collecting PII is the first point of risk. As soon as you bring data in, as soon as you're collecting some name, some address, you have to have consumer collection statements. You have to be addressing the rules at that point that you're taking that data in. But most companies can't stop collecting information. So they end up storing it, and that creates additional risk. Using it creates additional risk. But proliferation is really where the risk can expand dramatically if not taken care of in an appropriate manner. So we really focus our energy from an architectural perspective at AWS on partners that can enable technologies within AWS to help with this proliferation question, as well as, of course, the deletion question with things like Article 17 of right to be forgotten. So as we're designing this architecture, we came up with a few different design considerations. There were some obvious ones around how we handle personal identity. There were some less obvious ones. So, for example, when we were discussing ETL versus ELT, and I'll follow my own sword here, but I spend a lot of time thinking about ELT is the future, extract data from somewhere, load it somewhere, then transform it after it gets there, and realize that that means I'm writing personal information to my data lake, which means that there's a whole bunch of people that may have access to it as a result, from storage administrators and file system people to just regular identity management services. And so ETL in this case beats ELT, specifically with relation to PII. We worry much more about the proliferation and not the collection. And sometimes you just have to collect data in order to do business with someone. And if you don't collect the address and phone number, and et cetera, you may not be able to mail them a statement or be able to do business with them from managing customer expectations. We learned that hashing beats encryption, and this is really an interesting thing. That encryption has been hacked over many years, but hashing is really a one-directional process. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't use encryption. In some cases, that may be the business requirement, because maybe you have to come back to the original information. But I think you'll hear in the upcoming conversation from Frank how hashing is being used to really reduce risk. And then finally, when it comes to matching information, so there's organizations today where you can send all of your PII, and then your partner can send all of their PII, and then you can match within the centralized organization. Unfortunately, we believe that that creates a honeypot for hackers to find information about your entire list of customers. So we think that this next generation of decentralized computing and decentralized matching is the way to go, and one of the major reasons we partnered with Data Republic. So here's the architecture at a high-level glance. So there's a lot of little details in here. Not to scare you, not every single piece in here is necessarily needed for every environment. Some are just there because they create an answer for a particular problem. So I'll give you an example of that. You have video and images, and you're going to ingest that media. Now video and images may contain PII. It may contain a name and an address, or it may contain a name and a social security number related to things like healthcare transactions. So we have recognition that can go and scan all those images and look for characters on the or text on that particular image or video, and then tell us in a file that, hey, this information contains PII. So each of these partners inside of the platform have different elements of the architecture that take care of various elements. And so that's, we've been running various webinars throughout the week to talk about each one of them. But today I want to really talk about this Data Republic elements and how we get information matched between your environment and various second parties that may end up needing to use that data. And so with that introduction, I'd like to hand it off to Frank McKenna, who will discuss a little bit about what Data Republic's been doing in this space.
Thanks, Ryan, and hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to take you through Data Republic Senate. At Data Republic, we understand safe, secure data sharing and data collaboration is really complicated and hard to manage at scale. This is usually for 4 key reasons. First, every data share event has its own unique risk profile, and thus you can't treat them all the same. Secondly, the unique risk profile for each data sharing event leads organizations to take a bespoke approach each time, resulting in systemic risk. The more bespoke shares you do, the greater chance of one of them leading to misuse, data leak, or breach of privacy. Organizations often rely on default risk management method of putting controls in the data itself, such as aggregation or differential privacy. While this may be effective in managing risk, it can also reduce the utility and flexibility of the data, negatively impacting the ability of analysts to find the best answer. And lastly, we found most organizations lack a standard governance framework to discuss and implement secure data sharing. As a result, they struggle to get transaction and conversations between different stakeholders, both internally and externally, such as legal and IT departments. Our platform, called Senate, tackles these challenges head on, reducing systemic risk, reducing time and cost to value for analytics projects by up to 16 times, as you will hear from one of our customers next, providing solutions that unblock stalled analytics projects, significantly reducing PI risk for customer level analytics, and maximizes the utility of the data by freeing it of the need to carry all the risk controls. Our technology solves the complex legal and technical barriers to data exchange, unlocking data assets for organizations that have previously struggled to get access to data in useful formats. The data ecosystem on the platform enables new partnerships to be formed and licenses to be agreed. It allows analysts to collaborate on data sets securely using advanced cloud analytics tools in quarantined workspaces. And our most recent development, Senate Matching, allows for governed matching of PII without personal information leaving your organization. More on that later. Built into the DNA of our platform, we have a governance framework for data sharing. It provides a series of controls that can be dialed up or down to optimize the balance between managing risk and maximizing utility of the data for any given data sharing project. We have turned a long, complex, often insurmountable business and infrastructure challenge into a well-defined, governed, secure, and quick to implement technical workflow. It works like this. Each project is given its own secure governed space, which facilitates, governs, and audits the full workflow of the project from ideation to analytics. In the governed space, you can invite unapproved users from both organizations into a project, giving them defined roles. You can discuss permitted use and licensing terms of the data package. You can spin up a quarantine analytics workspace to see the results of a PII match and do any analytics. You can have the output checked against the license terms to ensure compliance. And you have a full audit of all interactions. Senate is built on AWS to securely manage workflows and storage of data exchange between organizations. We rely on AWS because it's faster and more efficient. The agile nature of AWS allows us to quickly and efficiently deploy, while its global footprint means we can securely manage the platform around the world. We also rely on AWS security compliance as part of our security standards. Senate, built on AWS, is relied upon by over 200 enterprises to manage their data sharing. For example, a bank and an airline recently used us for a project to reduce customer churn by matching and analyzing their overlapping customer data to assess customer risk involving credit card usage for international travelers. They used Senate to discuss the project, negotiate the license, perform a data match with de-identified transaction data, and perform the ongoing analytics in a quarantine environment. The governed workflow and PI matching tool allowed them to perform this data match which was previously not possible because of legal and technical roadblocks. Now I'd like to focus on one element of our solution called Senate Matching. This is a new technology within Senate that allows organizations to match data sets without PI having to leave the organization, and is core to the solution stack Ryan referred to earlier. Senate Matching ensures that PI remains in the organization's control inside their firewall, never accessible to another organization, including Data Republic. The matching is done on salted hash sliced variable length fragments within a distributed network. The analytics is done on encrypted temporal tokens within quarantine environments in Senate. Matching is subject to strict governance and licensing workflows and the whole process is fully governed in the Senate platform. Let me show you how it works in a little bit more detail. Here we can see a diagram that explains the Senate matching workflow. On the top, we can see the preparation phase. Within your own organization's environment, a copy of the PII is uploaded to the contributor node. The PII is tokenized with randomly assigned tokens, which will be used for analytics later. The PII is then salted, hashed, variably sliced, and then the majority of the sliced fragments deleted. The copy of the PII is then also deleted. It's not needed anymore. The remaining hash fragments are sent to the matcher network, with each encrypted fragment held in a different matcher node. On the bottom, we see the matching analytics phase. Anonymized attribute data, where the random tokens now represent the PII, is uploaded from your organization into a governed space. A data license is agreed, and the request for data match is approved. When the approved match is requested in Senate, the aggregator node executes the request, putting a call out to the matcher network for a hashed fragment match. The match is then returned, and the match data sets with an index table of match tokens is added to a quarantined analytics environment. We call it a discovery workspace within your governed space for secure analysis. Unlike other solutions, we don't dictate how the join needs to happen by presenting back a pre-join table. We maximize utility of the data by providing the analyst with an index table of matched temporary tokens, which gives them the flexibility to experiment on how best to join tables, such as using inner or outer or left or right joins. This revolutionary technology greatly reduces privacy risks for PII level matching while giving analysts maximum flexibility in their analytics. Our customers typically use the platform in three ways. A large insurance company uses us to share data internally between two of its divisions based in different geographical regions for an analytics project to better score car crash claims. Or, as in a bank and retail organization, to share data externally via our platform in order to provide joint marketing campaigns to their overlapping customer base. Others use our platform to enrich existing data sets. But rather than me telling you about how businesses are using Senate, let's hear from one of our customers. Jeff Menteplay from ANZ Bank, one of Australia's largest banks, and how Data Republic has accelerated their data sharing for his business. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks very much, Frank, and it's great to be with you, everyone. I'm from the Australia-New Zealand Banking Group, which is one of Australia and the South Pacific's major banking organisations. We're a full-service retail bank with national coverage. Obviously, a focus there on things like owning a home or running a small business, which is not a massive surprise to anyone who knows retail banking. But ANZ is also Australia's largest institutional and corporate bank, and we have a global footprint providing FX, structured finance and equity trading services, particularly in Asia, but around the world. My role in the bank is pretty special because I get to focus on helping the organisation understand the value of data faster rather than just talk about it. It's actually really having full contact encounters with data to really understand value and find out ways that we can use that to drive acceleration of innovation more generally. And in that context, I encountered Data Republic because I had a problem. Right now, my problem is that I press a button. And that was the idea of data sharing. Now, it won't surprise, I think, anyone on the call to say that a large and particularly banking organisation has to have an absolute priority on customer privacy, effective security and the control of data. In our jurisdiction, that's even more the case, as we've just been subject to an experience called a Royal Commission, which is effectively a long-term and wide-ranging federal investigation of misconduct and process in the banking sector. But at the same time that we had this focus, we also recognised that data sharing was an absolutely essential element of innovation in the data economy, and in fact in banking, an essential element of our core business. So in my role, what I discovered was two main challenges when launching a data sharing project. What's interesting about this is that the first of those was entirely internal. Okay, so as an enterprise, we didn't really have a coherent or sort of cohesive mindset around how do I get approval to share data. Every single time we did it was a point solution. Every single time we did it was a different lawyer, a different risk person, a different governance person, and ultimately a different process. And even when we got agreement that we wanted to just experiment or understand value, it almost created an entirely new journey to go, right, we've agreed, how are we going to do it? That process was then like, okay, how do we do it safely? How do we protect customer information if it's involved? How can we be sure that no one's going to run away with the data and do things that we didn't expect? The time frame around these two parts meant that from a solid definition of what you were trying to achieve to actually having an analyst in the data, whether to discover that there was anything there or not, was 6 to 12 months. Whilst there might have been one or two examples where it was less, that time frame was very common. And that time frame directly led to missing out on opportunities, whether it was to competitors, whether it was to an opportunity in the market, whether it was to a client relationship getting better or worse. Missing the opportunity was a critical sort of experience of ours in data sharing. So why did ANZ choose Data Republic and AWS? So we looked at this problem space and we said we have to reduce the time, we have to increase the speed. And we knew that that had some internal elements we needed to fix, but we also knew that we needed a pattern of execution outside the organisation. And Data Republic stood out for having a unique combination of features. The first is that the company's very reason for being is around the security and governance of data sharing. And not a lot of companies that's the only thing they do, that's what they do. And that ground up focus comes through in everything from the very moment that you start to work with Data Republic. That's led to the ability to have a flexible and fast creation of shared data assets. And I don't think it's a surprise that doing that in a way that allows you to move at the speed that you want to, and then discover that you didn't quite know how much of whatever you were trying to do you needed, meant that the cloud-based technologies were essential to sort of getting what we wanted. It was this combination of the reason, the security, and then the fact that it's in the cloud meant that we could access experts globally. It was scalable. If we found value, we could flip to production. But also, it was a flexible toolkit. And so when we were talking to organizations or experts who said, we want to work together on this, and they said, well, we want to work with a particular tool, be it SaaS, be it a particular open source library, etc., we could just flexibly deploy that in the analytics workspace. And so we could work the way our partners wanted to work, which completely changes the conversation, rather than saying, look, I'll fly and meet you and we'll see what happens. Or alternatively, do you want to come to Melbourne? The weather's fantastic, but you could just come and sit at one of our desks. And these two things didn't really make sense in a lot of context. Those four things meant that Data Republic was really the only game in town that kind of ticked the boxes. And it did it by directly addressing the challenges that were stopping us from accelerating. It had built-in governance controls. And in fact, those governance controls of our activation layer gave us a template to conduct the internal conversation. So we began to say, well, this is how we're governing something once we've agreed and we've got a legal framework in place. It's a very consistent, it is a logged and audited experience. For a business person to govern and decide and determine that there is a data share, what will be done with it, and what actually happened. Funnily enough, those features what we needed in the agreement phase. So we've used Data Republic actually as a technical platform and a process platform to push back through our organization into an enterprise approach to data sharing. It was a scalable solution that removed the risk of bespoke shares. So instead of if you like, a proliferation of data sources and data risks, rather than have a honeypot of data, we had for internal risk and compliance and control, a honeypot of auditable information about what we had agreed, who had participated down to the individual level, what they did, and it was all in one place. And that's been incredibly powerful, particularly as you look to your risk communities in an environment where GDPR is happening in one of your operating jurisdictions. It had a high security standard that was really based around protecting this private by design context. Obviously, being a bank, we have security teams and they get very excited when they can find problems with things. They were really quite impressed with the way that Frank and the Data Republic team have built a secure platform and one that really thought about how might the information get out from the ground up. One example is obviously you have a browser, you have information in the browser. So if someone can scroll through a table with a camera, they might be able to interpret that information. That might be why information could get out. And we were in a conversation where the Data Republic team said, oh yes, there are several scripted ways you might do that. And we've built some alerts into the platform to say that might be happening. It at least allows us to ask the question really fast. And that kind of three-dimensional thinking about how information is controlled was really powerful. And it enabled us to do de-identified matching of PI characteristics. Okay, so we could get the effective PI matching without PI ever leaving the organization. And that is incredibly powerful, particularly for the sort of applications that ANZ wanted to look at. So how does that translate to specific benefits? So I talked about my two halves of the problem, both of which could effectively persist for up to 6 months. Let's start from the point where we'd sort of rumbled through, 6 of the 6 to 12 months. We sort of rumbled through all those. We've argued, we've agreed. And even if we've said, yeah, it comes down to a USB stick or it comes down to someone coming behind the firewall, at that point, it would still often take us up to 4 months to kind of get ourselves organised and get things to happen. With Data Republic on our second data share, which happened, a lot of things went right, but we basically agreed in about 4 weeks, and then 1 week later we had analysts in the data. Like just a total transformation, and that was still while we were learning. And so, my KPIs are now to go from someone on this call calling me and us to identify a commercial thing in weeks, but then to complete an entire legal framework and actually have analysts in the data in 3 weeks. And you consider that in the context of 12 months is totally transformative. That speed and the fact that now my governance and risk communities feel safe talking about a Data Republic match, like it's one of the greatest things when someone goes, is this happening on Data Republic? And you go, yes, it is. And they go, oh, well, we won't ask you these 10 questions. That has allowed my team to go to my organisation and secure a pipeline of data projects. We created, if you like, a lower friction place. And that has drawn out of the business, this sort of low points, drawn out of the business like water, this demand to understand the value of data by sharing data or by having, if you like, sandboxed environments where external experts can access data. So that list of data sharing projects is going from a known list of sort of 20 to a prospect list of 80. And, then as word gets out, my small team effectively gets flooded as the business owner of this capability. And, we talk about pragmatic things. So now I've got this massive reduction. I'm overwhelmed with people loving what they could do. But what's a really practical outcome? So one example is a partner that we had been working with for 26 years. We talked to them about the customers that were involved in that partnership. We said, well, the customers have this product, there's your logo on it, so we know about those customers. we were actually able to use the PI matching capability of Senate to say, well, hang on, of our total customer base of millions of customers, rather than, and you've got twice as many millions of customers, how many actually have a relationship? And let's just then have a proper strategic conversation about what our brands can do together. We found 4 times more more shared relationships with that partner of 26 years than we had ever previously talked about. Now, you think about that. Your 2 companies have a 26-year partnership, and you go, oh, well, hang on, for every one person that we know about, there's 3 others that have a relationship with you, and I can share attributes and insights about those customers on a one-to-one level accurately, but then I can actually join them together and do analytics, and how that changes strategic conversation. So we've got an enormous amount out of Data Republic. It has changed our internal conversation. It's changed our external ability to act. It's done it with technology, but it's also done it with a vision of people and process. And with that, I think I hope that's interesting, and I'd like to hand back to Ryan.
Thanks, Jeff. I think it's very valuable information. I'm going to go ahead and start up the Q&A session. For anybody who hasn't yet had a chance to ask any questions, feel free to look on the right side. You'll see the questions pane, and you can ask a question there, and we'll go ahead and get started now. I'll start with a question from Dan. This is directed to Jeff. Do you think the global trend is towards more privacy controls, such as like GDPR is requiring, or more openness of data, especially when it comes to banking? Or do you think that there's a balancing of the two?
That's a great question. Interestingly, about those 2 dimensions, I think the answer is yes. I'm not sure whether that's dodging them. No, so I think clearly and partially as a result of what's happening in the digital economy, in the large technical companies, there may well be people on this call who have made a business of doing an end run around the intention of privacy law. Okay, the digital advertising community was like, I don't know who you are, but I know that you're pregnant, or I know that you've got a particular inclination, and I'm almost 100% sure that that's you, so I market to you. And I think the GDPR and other things are a response to that, of giving effect to I know you, and then I've got this sort of fig leaf that I don't. And I think that's the world we live in. Australia is not yet at GDPR levels of privacy law, but we are simply saying, well, that's where the world is going to go. Okay. What's interesting about that is that in an organisation like banking, the regulators sitting in the next office are saying the data is the consumer's data, particularly in retail banking, and they have the right to make you share it. And so as an organisation, we're going to have a bunch of data assets that previously we felt were proprietary and gave us competitive advantage moving out into the open world. And in that context, the data sharing is going to massively increase. So how do you square that circle? And I think it is about having a very carefully thought through structure to say, I can understand the power of a piece of data when it gets to me. When I see it, I can interpret it. But I gather that capability through very carefully managed data sharing and analytics in advance that allow me to understand the data, but that also I can tell a consumer where it went. I can tell them whether they were re-identified or identified at all. I can tell them what I found out, and I can tell them whether I had consent to do that. So you've kind of got a yes on both sides. We are just accepting it. We are, this entire conversation about data sharing and Data Republic is part of our organisation's response to that by saying we have to radically improve our ability to explain to a consumer or a small business or a business what we did with their data. But also it allows us to create environments that mean we are ready to act in milliseconds when we actually see a pattern in data because we have tested it and we know that we have to take a particular action.
So, Joe, I think that begs a follow-up question too. So, you talked more generically about the kinds of partnerships you might do business with. It. Can you give us any examples of the kinds of companies where you might do a data share?
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing about the data sharing conversation for banking is that banks, by their nature, have pooled and shared data as a central part of their business model. We're all familiar with credit bureaus, and I think we're all familiar with the potential problems of a centralised bureau. We desperately need it. We have to have it to understand risk, but actually there can be problems with that kind of centralisation. So if you look beyond credit to some other terrains, you've got fraud, AML, KYC, malfeasance, where actually the ability to say, I don't necessarily need to know, or I want to control what I know about the individuals because of privacy, but I absolutely want to be able to recognise and understand patterns so that I can respond to them in those fields. That's a really classic one. But in retail banking also, it's not uncommon to have relationships with airlines or insurers or retail providers or particular brands where the consumer knows that there's a relationship between the two parties. They're actually quite comfortable with that because they've got the product or they do business with the organisation. But that's where we think there's a massive terrain to kind of expand non-identifiable analytical data sharing to really change the conversation with those brands. So rather than just have the conversation about 1 million customers, have the conversation about 4 million. Because that actually, if you do it the right way, means your propositions to market fundamentally change.
That's a great answer. I think this is a good question. I think this is directed towards Data Republic, but what kind of softwares do you offer around collecting data, for example, streaming data, and what kind of help do you provide on cleaning the data to prepare for sharing?
Thanks, Ron. We actually have a whole host of software tools and services we can provide to help our clients become more successful in their analytics outcome. And we have a data team of data scientists who can actually have conversations with clients about their data and how to use the data and how to best and leveraging our experience across all industries about how best to use it. In regards to the actual data, and also they can also make recommendations as to potential partnerships and who to reach out to augment the analytics with either data sets or with analytics partners to get a better outcome. So in the tools themselves, we have a full set of analytics tools and data cleaning tools in those quarantine environments that actually help clients get the most out of the data. One of the insights I would say is that a lot of organizations sometimes struggle and they talk about the quality of the data for a data share. We find it's not quality is the problem, it's fit for purpose. Often they're having data sets they've never thought of sharing before, and they're trying to use it for another purpose, a secondary purpose. And they really need to think about how fit it is for that purpose and what needs to be done for it. So it's a perfect quality for its primary purpose, but it struggles maybe on the secondary purpose. And when organizations are thinking about using it for sharing, I think they need to give more time up front to understand, okay, what is the data set they have and how fit is it for what they need to do and what changes they need to have or make to make it better fit for the needs.
Perfect. Chris asked the question, how does the Data Republic platform address issues of data sovereignty?
Great question. We have a regional presence. At the moment, we're in 3 countries and expanding rapidly. We're in Australia, Singapore, and of course in the US. And I'm looking to expand into Canada and Europe soon. When you set up a data share, or when you're doing it, part of the conversation should be, and again, we have some clients that organization, that insurance company, they had a regional sovereignty question as well, which was, where should this happen? What our platform allows you to do is have that conversation across regions and then decide which region you actually want it to happen in. in a roadmap, we also are looking at organizations being able to have the analytics happen and the data is at rest in the different regions so that they can actually start doing analytics across regions.
Perfect. So a lot of the data sharing examples we talked about on are really related to commercial or consumer oriented. Has DR facilitated any social good projects? I think there's a couple of customers on here that are in that space and want to know.
Oh, absolutely. That's a key part of what we believe in, and we want to help the world decide more wisely. And we believe in that data is used to benefit others. We have an organization we work with, which is called Minerva, and they actually just do for social good. And we help join both analysts and data sets together. Just recently, we had in the Melbourne Business School with the Victorian state government working together with other corporations, including several large banks, to do a datathon over a weekend to see what social good came out of certain data sets. And actually, one of the outcomes was by using health data from the Victorian government, by using bank transaction data and also retail data, they were able to come up with a better algorithm to improve immunization rates within the state. And that's something we fully support and are always open to more conversations about.
Yeah, I think I've actually seen a bunch of different projects related to domestic violence, and I think there was even some around brain activity and mental illness. So I think just really interesting things that you guys are doing with that side of it. I talked a little bit about GDPR Article 30, and there's a question really related to how Data Republic gets involved in the compliance and regulations around GDPR. So I'll start by saying that one of the reasons I wanted to include you guys in this design architecture was because of some of the GDPR requirements. GDPR Chapter 5 is really all around data sharing and managing any content that's going between different organizations. And then Article 30 is reporting out an audit log, so to speak, of any data sharing activity and the purpose of that sharing. But I'm not sure if there's anything that you want to add to how Data Republic gets involved in managing GDPR in some way.
Yes, thanks, Ron. Yeah, Data Republic helps in many ways with GDPR. As you've alluded to, one is that when we do a data share, we keep a full audit trail of where the data is and the lineage of where it actually ends up. As part of the licensing process, we also link into what the intended use of the project is, and that would also very much aligns to the whole concept of permitted use. And it allows organizations that if a customer doesn't want their data use for one particular use, but allows for another particular use, we can actually track that down and say which projects are doing it for the non-allowed use. We have the full audit logs of everything that happens. And most importantly, because of the way we use with the tokens, is that if the customer wants to be forgotten, we can cut that off at source. We can cut it off the contributor node and have it flow all the way through the system. And because we're not actually sharing raw data, the tokens are useless. Even if they have those temporal tokens, they cannot be used again. And so there's lots of things we can do to help organizations with their GDPR compliance.
Yeah, Ryan, I might jump in. I mean, we did make a comment before the call began that I am not in my data governance function. I'm ultimately the commercial guy who waves his hands around and says he wants to do everything. But with regards to GDPR, what we do as an Australian organisation with potential European exposure or European natural citizens who might be in our data set, as it turns out, half our federal parliament is European natural citizens, who was to know, which, by the way, for those in the call, results in them being kicked out of parliament. But the key issues we said internally, we spent a lot of time looking at the use case. So we actually evaluate GDPR when we start to think about agreement, that internal component of the process. But what Data Republic does is says that the critical element of GDPR, control and the ability to tell the information, the data contributor, the person who gave you that data, where it went and what happened, completely changes the conversation. So I don't think that Data Republic solves it, but it gives you technical mechanisms to comply. And that's, I think, the essential element of Data Republic in our GDPR strategy.
So follow-up question here is, are there any specific industries that you find this to be really relevant to? I know you mentioned banking, airline, travel, or loyalty. Are there other industries that have more data sharing than others that they should look at this?
Yeah, actually, sorry, I'll let Jeff go first.
No, just you go, Frank. It's interesting because I've worked in 4 different sort of dimensions of financial services and media. So I think that almost any company either will have an example where sharing data with one of its partners or suppliers would lead to a better level of commercial understanding. And that in that case, you might not match on PI. You might match on SKU or POS terminal performance or other things. But it's not just sharing as in combination of data sets. It's also any organisation can benefit from saying, I want an expert over there to work with my data and bring all their skills to it, but I don't actually want to give it to them. So I think data sharing is a really general concept, but you dive in, Frank.
Actually, and that's a great point there, Jeff. What we're finding is that organizations are sharing data all the time. They just sometimes they haven't just pinned it down to that, and that's in all industries. So examples of where we've been used for data sharing or governed data sharing is contractors coming in to work on data sets, or analytics professionals who may be in a different country coming in to work on a data set for an organization. We've had lots of examples of internal data sharing where organizations in different regions or even just different departments or different legal entities within the same corporate group are trying to share data. And it's about the sharing the data and having a full audit log to show compliance with all the rules and regulations. Some industries do lend themselves more at the moment, and that, as you pointed out, would be the banks, airlines, utilities, and travel and retail. And governments as well. They're very much into both open data sets and internal data sharing for a better view of the citizen. What we are finding though now is that in order to compete, a lot of organizations are reaching out to us to discuss how do we leverage our data and use other data sets so we can have a more 360 view of our customers to understand them better, to offer them better services and look for better strategic partnerships. And there are some natural alliances that go on. Airlines and banks are a natural alliance, utilities and telcos also a natural alliance. So we find it everywhere, and it's actually really exciting because, as Jeff alluded to before, once you start saying to people, it's not so difficult. You can actually, it's a straightforward workflow and process, and so start opening yourself to opportunities. The opportunities just flow out. We started with one organization, and we started with 3 use cases, and by the time we'd finished the conversation, we'd come out with 50 because of all the opportunities, of which they were willing to start with the first 5 very quickly. So I think all organizations this is relevant to. Those with customer records, B2C are always the most prevalent, but all organizations can benefit from this.
Ryan,
I'll add on that. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
I was just saying, just on that, we've focused this conversation on data sharing and analytics, and that's certainly the heartland. to go a little more out there to a discussion we're having more broadly about innovation is often when we want to test pieces of software, that goes into, oh, hang on, we need to provide effectively some form of data for the software to operate on. There's a whole class of AI startups, of risk evaluation models, of even apps that you go, if I could only give them effectively a snapshot of transaction and time series data, they could simulate, they could run. We are thinking about Data Republic in that context because I've got a cloud platform with a sandbox that no one can get into. I'm happy with their security schema, and I've got a pipeline and a governance process to put de-identified data sets in there. So we're thinking about Data Republic not just as a sharing and analytics service, but a safe place where data can be and compute can run. And I know that there's a partnership, for instance, with a company called HyperAnna, which is an AI, an exploratory tool. And we're like, well, we can just dump a chunk of our institutional data set into a sandbox and they can install HyperAnna. We're comfortable with that because it's safe. And again, we think that radically reduces the innovation window to actually understand the real world impact. So again, the capabilities of the platform combined with AWS really can have a second degree of impact.
Yeah, I think I've had a couple of interesting insights from this. One was that I was talking to a customer about this whole data sharing thing, and they were saying, "Oh, we don't have any consumer customers. We're a B2B shop, and so we don't keep track of any customer names or PI." And I said, "Well, you have HR, right? So you have employees. Employees are humans, so you have their information in a database. And so even just transferring information between you and your payroll provider is the data sharing, which I was thrown off that that's a very good example from any company. I also found an interesting one in talking to a mortgage provider, and this may be something you guys are already doing. But data sharing from the perspective of a person going for a mortgage no longer needs to provide any information. So sending me your bank statements or sending me your payroll checks or anything else that might be needed to get your underwriting approved in the future could just be a data sharing agreement with a de-identified matching system. So I could see that being a really interesting example. Is that those kinds of things ANZ's thinking about too?
Interesting on some of those more operational use cases on the retail side. We're subject to an open banking regime coming in July 2019, which is similar to PSD2 in Europe. So we're likely to have an independent infrastructure for that. What is interesting is we're highly likely to use Data Republic to get ready for that because we can actually create pools of data across maybe us and a smaller bank, have a shared analytics environment and actually say, well, what are we going to see when suddenly this data can flow in the application process, etc. In the business and commercial banking regime, I think absolutely. There are obviously accounting service providers that can provide you with a data feed. But again, how you actually get ready to interpret that, we think Data Republic plays a natural role.
Perfect. I'm just going to give a couple minutes more left. Just a reminder to anybody who wants to ask any last minute questions. I've got one or two here, but if you have more, please feel free to ask them now. How do you handle on-prem versus cloud? So if you have data in an on-prem environment and you want to get into the cloud environment, how do you deal with that?
Yes. You go first.
No, I think Frank, there's probably two sides. So the first is the business side. So the business side, any business is like getting comfortable with security, getting comfortable with where your perimeter is and what goes into what zone. Data Republic for us simplified that. We deal with them. We're happy that they are a safe place. And because we can effectively guarantee that no PI leaves our organisation, it lowers some areas of risk enough that it's made the cloud discussion much simpler in this use case. So Data Republic just helped us lower the risk concerns in the first instance. But then in the second instance, when they demonstrated value, and we demonstrated value out of the infrastructure approach Data Republic offered as well, it made other cloud discussions easier, even potentially when there was more sensitive information involved. So it's interesting. I think Data Republic simplifies your early phase cloud discussions. But Frank, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, actually, that's a great point you make there, Jeff. What does on-prem mean? For some organizations, they think of on-prem sitting in a server room, and that means on-premise. But what we're finding now is that more and more organizations are thinking on-premise as being part of their kind of private element of the public cloud, and that's now becoming part of the conversation. It's basically data within their control and where that sits, and that's where where we actually can help them play. Our tools can, like the contributor node actually sits on-premise, and we can hook up for data feeds from private clouds to bring data on board. And we also have a live proof of concept out there, which we're now bringing into the full set product, which actually takes data at rest on-premise, brings it into the quarantined discovery workspace or the analytics workspace directly, or can actually we just govern the whole process, because ultimately we're a SaaS platform, and ultimately we're about building an ecosystem of which facilitates you establishing easy relationships with others. So we can govern the data sharing within that ecosystem, within your own private ecosystem, or across the whole of Data Republic's ecosystem. So the data can go from on-prem, so basically within your control, inside your firewall, to another organization that's inside the firewall, or we can provide that independent quarantine space to provide analytics in full control. So we can work with on-premise, and we are getting more and more ability to work with on-premise. But I think really when you have that conversation about on-prem and what's in your control, and to Jeff's point, I would encourage people to think about, okay, is on-prem meaning the cloud as well?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I think there's a lot of people who think about their private VPC as their on-prem environment, in quotes. Really about it kind of shifts the conversation more around data control as opposed to physically where the data is, and so that's an interesting point. I think we're closing up the hour here. I want to thank the presenters, so Frank McKenna and Jeff Mentefley. Thank you for coming today. I want to thank all of the attendees for taking time out of your day today. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful rest of your week. Take care. Bye-bye.